Welcome to the Shadle Financial Group Adulting 101 webinar. We're excited to put together. This is going to be the first of many versions of this that we do. So definitely excited about it. And I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into things. So whether you're a recent college graduate or whether you've been adult for a few years now or even longer, the purpose of today is just to cover some foundational topics for your personal finances, just to make sure that you create good money habits. We're going to cover a variety of topics from where to keep your cash, budgeting, setting goals for your future, and everyone's favorite topic, which is taxes. I'm getting there. But when we kick in, let's start with checking versus savings. And when you go to the bank, not all accounts are created equal and they're not all the same. So the two main types that we have for bank accounts are going to be checking account and savings accounts. So checking accounts, they're going to be designed for your day-to-day life. They usually don't pay much interest, if at all, but they're not designed to pay interest. They're designed to help you pay your bills, receive income like your paycheck, and you usually have an unlimited number of transactions each month, which is different from a savings account. With that checking account, you usually also can get a debit card, checks, usually at no cost, both of which you can use to pay your bills. Although when you can try and do your best to use a credit card for purchases. We'll talk about more on that later. Now, when we talk about a savings account, this is designed for money that you don't need right now, but you might need in the near future. This is where you should have your emergency fund. So what's an emergency fund? An emergency fund is for the unexpected expenses that life tends to throw your way. So when we talk about an emergency fund, it's typically considered fully funded, meaning you've got enough in there and you should start doing other things. When you've got somewhere between 3 and 6 months worth of your fixed expenses, plus any major purchases you're going to have over the next 6 to 12 months. This could be things like a car, an engagement ring, a big trip that you're planning, or maybe working towards a down payment, although that, depending on the timeline, that might need to be done in another way. You want to have your savings account somewhere where it's going to earn the most amount of interest, typically a high yield savings account. Right now, you should expect that to be somewhere in the 3.25 to 3.75 range. That's a percent range. Now, once you get your 3 to 6 months of fixed expenses and your big expenses, at this point, you don't need to put any more money into this account and you need to start earmarking your savings elsewhere. Now, I kind of talk about 3 to 6 months. Sometimes it's really important to hyper focus on the emergency fund. Sometimes you just want to kind of get that seeded, maybe 1 month's worth, and then start to add 401k matching or 401k contribution, especially if you're getting a match, starting to pay down debt. So ultimately you want to get to 3 to 6 months, but that doesn't mean that you should sacrifice anything and everything in order to get there. So I know technically budget has 6 letters in the word, but I know for some people it feels like a 4-letter word because they absolutely hate budgeting. Now, my belief on budgeting is that it's not to be the fun police, but it is designed for you to be intentional with how you spend your money to make sure that where your money is going aligns with what your goals and objectives are. So the first step for your budget is to break out your fixed expenses versus your variable expenses. So examples of fixed expenses are going to be things like rent, a mortgage payment if you have one, car payment, your utilities, maybe even streaming services. These are things that are usually the same amount or very similar, and they're easy to plan for because they don't change a lot from month to month. Typically, these also align with things that you need to do, especially in that debt payment, like a student loan, in addition to some of those other things that I mentioned. Now, variable expenses, these are things that can vary from month to month, like eating out, traveling, shopping. And sometimes every 1 month isn't going to look the same. So sometimes you need to accrue for that. Maybe you can have a line item for travel and you allocate $400 a month, but you don't travel every single month. Maybe that's every couple of months or whatever that needs to look like for your specific situation. When you look at your budget, make sure that your expenses are not more than your income after you've paid taxes. That's a really important part of this, especially if you haven't not used to working or you're not used to paying income taxes. We'll talk about that a little bit more about how we budget, but your expenses should be against your net income, not your gross income. Net income means what you actually see after you pay taxes, health insurance, all the fun stuff that adulting comes along with. In fact, when you look at your take-home pay, make sure you allocate for some savings and then build your budget with what is left. I'm a really big fan of paying yourself first. So you see this 28-36 rule. What on earth is that about? Well, all this rule says is that no more than 28% of your gross income should be spent on housing. So I was just talking about net income for a second. Now we're going to talk about gross income. So if you make $4,000 a month, you shouldn't spend more than 28% of that on your rent. So that would be about $1,120 or your mortgage payment. Now, that's not exactly perfect, but that's what the guideline is supposed to be. So try not to get that expensive apartment where your rent is 50% of your gross pay, especially if it's your first time getting out there. That can really set yourself up because that 12-month lease is locked in stone for 12 months. And that kind of sets you behind the 8 ball a little bit. Now that's the 28% part. The 36% says your gross income or 36% of your gross income should go towards all housing and debt combined. So going back to that same $4,000 example, that means that rent, student loans, stuff like that shouldn't be more than 1,440. Now I get that that's not a perfect world, but that's really what you should be targeting for when you're trying to look about that 28-36 rule. So when we're looking at that, I kind of alluded to that big expensive apartment. Also be careful about getting that big expensive car with a big car payment before you get your first house. Now I say that because when lenders look to get you approved for your mortgage, they're going to look at something called your debt to income ratio, meaning they're going to look at how much all of your debt payments are in relation to your gross income. Now, for a mortgage, they usually want to see that lower than 43%. Now, again, we want housing to be 28%. 43, 28, that's the big difference. So what you can get approved for is 43%. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what you should do. 43% of your gross income going towards housing is a lot. Remember, we want that to be more like 28%. But if you go out and you get that nice car payment because YOLO, you want to treat yourself, but your car payment is 20% of your gross income, it's really going to make it hard to get that mortgage payment. So really be careful, especially in those first couple of years working, about going out and getting that big apartment, going out and getting that big car payment. You can save to get towards those things so that you don't have a big car payment. While we're on cars, please do not go out and get a 7-year car loan. Yes, that makes the payment lower, but a car is a depreciating asset, and that is how you get what's called upside down on your car loan, meaning you owe more on your car than you do or more than what the car is worth. So if you ever needed to sell it, you're still going to be in a pickle because even if you sell the car, you're still going to owe more than what you would get if you sold it. So when we're talking about setting goals, it's really important to make your goals as concrete as possible, which is really going to help you focus on what's really important. So when we talk about setting goals, we want to use this SMART acronym. So when we look at that, excuse me, the S is going to stand for specific. So we want the goal to be specific. It's clearly defined and you can describe it in detail. So precisely what do you want to accomplish? I want to have a new car isn't specific. I want to buy a car that is worth $40,000 in the next 3 years. That is a very specific goal that you can go accomplish. Now, the M is measurable. So measurable means you need to be able to track your progress and clearly know whether you've reached it or not. So again, going back to that same example about the car, I want to buy a car for $40,000. Well, in order for that to happen, maybe you need to save up $10,000 for a down payment so that the 4-year car loan, which is usually what I try and keep a car loan at or below, maybe you need to have $10,000 saved so that your monthly payment is manageable enough to not impact everything else you want to do. In fact, sometimes what you can do is model that car payment and then start saving that amount to make sure that you're comfortable with it. And then you use that car payment. So if you're trying to target a $400 a month car payment, save $400 a month to get to that down payment. And then you'll know that $400 that you've allocated towards saving for the down payment is a comfortable amount for a car payment. So that's measurable. Now, attainable is also really, really important. Goals can be challenging, but you need to have a fair chance of achieving them. So, maybe saying I want to save $1 million in 5 years is not an attainable goal for most people. But if you say, I want to have $1 million saved in 30 years, that is a lot more attainable. That doesn't take a lot in order to do. So just make sure you're framing it that it's okay to stretch, but just make sure you have a good chance of being able to do it. Now, relevant means that the goal just needs to make sense to you and that it reflects your specific needs and your values. So goals that are relevant should be something that you get excited about because they're going to be important to you. So saving $10,000 for a down payment on a car or $25,000 for a down payment on a house so that you can own your home, those can be things that are relevant because maybe you've always wanted that car or you dream of owning your home, but something that is going to be exciting to you to work towards so that when you're making those sacrifices today by saving for the future, you know why you're making those sacrifices because there's light at the end of the tunnel or something to work towards. Now, the last thing is going to be timely. So you need to have a time frame or a deadline for your reaching your goals. So maybe you want to have your credit card debt paid off by the end of next year, or I really want to get these student loans paid off in the next 5 or the next 10 years. That's really, really important. And I think along with all of those things, it's really important to write down all your goals. I think sometimes, whether it's budgeting or whether it's goals, sometimes we just have things floating around in our head and we never take the time to write them down. Sometimes they can seem daunting because you think about all these different things. But if you actually write them down and create a list and you can prioritize them and actually give yourself action items, it makes them seem less scary and it also makes them a lot more attainable. Maybe saving $10,000 seems like a lot because you just got your first job and maybe you're only making 45,000 or 30,000 or whatever that number is. But if you can say, hey, if I need to save $10,000, but my timeline is 3 years from now and I can get a little bit of growth out of that, then, $10,000 seems like a lot, but $275 a month for 3 years gets you that number without any growth. So maybe that's a lot more palatable to get to that $10,000 number. So it's just really important to make sure when you're setting goals that you're following the SMART acronym. So credit is also something that's going to be really important. So if we were to pull out Merriam-Webster's dictionary, all of you guys that just got out of college or in study mode might appreciate this. They define credit as the provision of money, goods, or services with the expectation of a future payment. So when it comes time to finance big ticket items such as a home or a car, most of us are going to need some sort of loan, at least at first. And there are many times like shopping for Christmas or going on vacation when it's just most convenient to use credit in the form of a credit card to use purchases, but as long as you're using this smartly. Now, when it comes time to get a loan, whoever's lending you the money is going to want to know about your income and your credit score. Okay, heard about credit. They're talking usually about your credit score if you have credit. Your credit score is a number that is assigned based on your past history of the loans that you've had or have. So when you look at your credit score, it's going to range somewhere between 300 to 850. If you've never had a credit card or a loan, you're not going to have a credit score because you don't have any credit history. Now, two of the biggest factors with your credit score are going to be your payment history, which just means, did you make all of your loan payments on time? A missed or a late payment can stay on your credit and penalize you for 10 years. Now, the other big part is your revolving utilization. And no, I'm not talking about those doors in front of big buildings or hotels that revolve around, although we can use that as an analogy. Your revolving utilization is how much of your available credit that you use, usually around credit cards. So if we look at having a credit card and you've got a total limit on one, or if you have two or three, if we look at your total available limit, and that is $10,000, but you have a $5,000 balance, your revolving utilization is 50% because you have used 5,000 of your $10,000 available credit. The reason this is considered revolving is because as you pay down that credit card balance, that becomes available for you to borrow again. So if you've got a $10,000 limit, you have a $5,000 balance, but you then pay that down to 1,000, instead of having $5,000 available for you to use, because again, a $5,000 balance on a $10,000 limit still gives you a $5,000 that you can borrow. If you pay that down to 1,000, you now have $9,000 available. This is different than a car loan, which is an installment loan, which as you pay it down, you can't borrow against it again unless you get a new loan. Now, when we look at this revolving utilization, again, it's really important. We are looking at this to be below 30%, but the lower, the better. So how do we get a credit score? Well, you have to start by actually getting some credit. And a credit card is a really good way to get some payment history. So be careful about how you use it. Don't YOLO, don't go out, go out to the bar or go do a bunch of travel with no intentions of paying it back anytime soon. That can really put yourself in a bad spot. But you use it for everyday items, kind of like some of those fixed expenses we talked about earlier. So for groceries, gas in your car, things you know you're going to spend, just make sure you pay the balance off every single month. If you pay your balance in full by the payment date, you won't accrue any interest. Now, if you don't pay it off in full, the entire balance gets charged interest. And on credit cards, we're usually talking about rates, especially if you don't have very good credit or a very long credit history, in the 20%. Sometimes we even see those in the 30% range. That is a lot of interest. Now, if your credit is good enough, you can get credit cards that actually will help you accrue points and you can get cash back. So that can be ways to help offset some of your travel costs. If travel is really important to you, maybe look at getting a credit card that's going to have really good travel benefits. Maybe there's a sign up bonus where you can get a couple of free flights or get hotel stays. But just make sure that if you're using it, you're using it very safely. Another thing, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but a credit card gives you a lot better payment protection than a debit card would. So if someone gets your credit card information and makes a fraudulent purchase, all you have to do is call the credit card company, say, I did not make that payment, and they'll go ahead and take care of it. They have a whole team of people that will go deal with that, and you're going to be fine. Now, if that same thing happens with your debit card, with your checking account, yes, you can commit fraud, or not commit fraud, you can claim fraud, and they'll eventually take it off, but that is out of your account and it may take them 6 to 8 weeks to put that money back into your account. Also, I keep talking about travel. If you ever go to a hotel and put your card down on file for incidentals, they may put a hold for $300-400. And if you put your debit card down, that money comes out of your checking account and that could get you overdrawn. That could have money that's not going to be available for you to use. It can create some other issues. So it's just really important to have a credit card, even if it's your first one, even if it's not going to get you really great rewards, it's important to get something and to begin that credit history in order to help down the road. Now, this is something that I've been talking a lot about a lot lately, especially considering the affordability issues that we're seeing, and that's renting versus owning. There's nothing wrong with renting. Renting is typically going to be better if you're going to be in the location for less than 3 years. So if you just graduated and you're moving to a new town, or if you're not sure if you're going to be somewhere, then renting can make a lot of sense. But also sometimes owning a home can make a lot of sense. And I know that that is sometimes considered, owning a home can be the foundation of American dream, but it's just not for everybody. Now, another thing with renting is it usually means that you have a fixed cost. So if your rent is $1,000 a month, or if you can find some roommates and you can get that down a little bit, which is usually a good thing. I know sometimes it's not fun to have roommates, but that's a really good way to get your costs down. but your fixed cost with your rent, it usually is going to cover everything. Now, maybe you've got utilities, cable, internet, some things like that that'll be on top of that. But if something comes up and a hot water heater goes out, or if there's a leaky faucet, guess what? You call your landlord, they take care of it. So renting with that fixed cost can make sense, especially if you're trying to save up for a down payment, because you don't have the trouble or something goes wrong. It's not your responsibility. You're not the homeowner. But buying a home can also be a great way to accumulate wealth, especially if you use a mortgage to help with the purchase of that home. Um, I'll talk about this little thing in just a second, but some mortgages, especially if you've heard 20% down payment, some mortgages only require as little as a 3% down payment. So that can make it a lot easier to get into that mortgage, while some types of mortgages require a 20% down payment. Now, usually the more you put down, the better your rate is. But if you're talking about whether getting into a home or not, sometimes having a smaller down payment, even with a higher rate, makes more sense because it makes it easier for you to get into that home. So, if you're going to buy a home, maybe you can buy a 2 or a 3 bedroom house or condo, and then you can rent out those other rooms in order to help with your mortgage payment. Again, it's not the sexiest way to do it, but it is a really smart way to do it. And then when you think about buying a home, most time your first home is not your forever home. I think sometimes that's really hard. People want that big shiny house, but if you can get your first home and then you stay there for a year, it's important to be there for at least a year, maybe 2 years, 3 years. Once you've got that house for at least a year, you can then actually go buy another house and then rent out your first house without doing anything with the mortgage. Now, if it's your primary residence, meaning where you live, the rate is usually going to be a lot better than an investment property. But if you buy it when it's your primary residence and use it for at least a year, you double check on the terms of your loan. Sometimes it can be a little bit longer, but at least a year. At that point, you can then rent it out and it be an investment property and it not impact your rate. So you could also sell that house, use the equity that hopefully you've accumulated to then roll into your next house. But most people don't buy one house and live there forever. Usually they own 3 to 7 houses. So just keep that in mind. Buy a house, let the house appreciate in value, hopefully over time, pay down some of the principal on the mortgage, build equity in that house. And then as your income grows and your equity grows, that's when then you can help think about getting that upgrade. Maybe you go from a 2 bedroom condo to a 3 bedroom house, and then from that 3 bedroom house to a 4 bedroom house, and then that 4 bedroom house allows you to then eventually get into the house of your dreams in the neighborhood of your dreams. But don't let the fact that where you want to be seems unattainable right now. Remember thinking about those goals in order to get there. So really, really important. But there's nothing wrong with renting. You don't need to own a home. It can be nice. So just think about things or ways to kind of build towards that. Now, I want to talk the difference between investing and saving. So, saving part of your income for your future is one of the bedrocks for financial planning. Saving is super important, but what you do with your money once you save it is just as important. You need to have cash in the bank for your emergency fund, but once that's funded, you need to be investing in assets that can actually grow a lot faster than cash. So, I know I mentioned rates earlier than this, but if you're only earning 3% on your money, it will double every 24 years. So it would take $10,000, 24 years to turn into about $20,000 if you're earning 3%. Well, let's say if you took that $10,000 and instead invested it and you were able to earn 10% and it doubles in about 7.3 years, instead of it taking 24 years to get to 20,000, it would only take 7.3 years. And oh, by the way, a lot of the times when you're investing in growth assets like this, you can get capital gains treatment instead of ordinary income, which means you pay less taxes on that growth. So now if we took that $10,000 and you kept it invested for 24 years, that $10,000 would now be worth more than $98,000. So again, that $10,000, if you saved it and earned 3% in 24 years, it'd be worth 20,000. If you invested it and it's able to average 10%, it turns into 98,000. That is 78,000 more dollars in 24 years if you invested versus just saving it. So saving is important to get the money out of your paycheck and into account. but what you do with it once you save it is really, really important. So, when you get out into the wild and you're on your own, and maybe you've been on your own a little bit, but you're going to have insurance to deal with. So there's a lot of different kinds of insurance, but health insurance is a common one that most Americans have. You pay your premiums each month to the health insurance company, and they help cover the cost of your medical bills when you go to the doctor or the hospital, by paying that premium each month. And part of the expenses, they limit how much you have to spend in any given year. So let's say you had $50,000 of healthcare expenses, like you could in a year if you had a baby. You might only end up having to pay 10, 15, or maybe even less, depending on how your insurance is set up, which is why you have the insurance. Life insurance is another common form of insurance. The insurance company will pay you a tax-free death benefit to your heir in the event you pass away. Now you can buy cheap term insurance, which is better than permanent insurance. And usually term insurance has a fixed rate for a certain period of time, like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Permanent insurance, this would be things like whole life, variable policies, universal life. They can accumulate some cash value over time. Sometimes people will try and sell that to you as it being, hey, it's an investment for an insurance. Don't do that when you're young. There's reason to own permanent insurance, but when you're young is not the reason to do that. Term insurance is usually way better than younger families. But if you don't have a family, if you don't have someone that's depending on your income other than you, life insurance isn't really that important, which by the way, if you work for a big company, they're probably offering you some life insurance for free. Disability insurance, if you don't have anybody depending on you, it's probably more insurance. Disability insurance is something that will pay you if you were unable to work for some reason. So let's say you're working and then all of a sudden you have a health issue that prevents you from work. Well, your company's not going to keep you around forever if you can't work. That disability insurance policy would kick in if you're not able to work for an extended period of time and would help you replace that paycheck. Again, if you work for a big company, a lot of the times they'll offer it for free or they'll offer it very cheaply through your group. So looking at your group benefits through work is usually a great place to check off a lot of these boxes. So speaking about benefits at work, retirement savings is really important. So when you're thinking about something to do, it may not seem fun when you're in your 20s to think about saving for the future, but I promise you, the earlier you can start, the better off you will be. You have the benefit of compound earnings, which I talked about earlier about that 10,000 growing to 98,000. And if your company offers a match, make sure you are taking advantage of the match. That is super, super important. That is free money. A match can either be elective or non-elective. An elective match means you need to save something in order to get the match. Again, make sure if they require you to put away 5% to get 4, do the 5%. This is free money. Make sure you're taking advantage of that. If it's a non-elective contribution, it just means they put it in whether you do it or not. You should still be doing it. I know it might seem like a lot, but if you're trying to save for your future, trying to get up to 10% total is really important. So if it's 4%, try and do 6. But again, we're trying to do emergency fund, we're trying to do savings. This is where we talk about, doing something now, even if you only can do 3% to retirement to get some of the match, you're doing some into your emergency fund and you're some towards paying off those student loans. These are all goals to work towards, and you just kind of start to take care of a little bit as you go. Now, when we talk about Roth versus traditional, this just kind of controls how you put the money in. So with the Roth, the money goes in after you've already paid federal and state income taxes. Since you've already paid taxes on this money, if you're 59 and a half, have had the Roth for at least 5 years, and sometimes there's some other quirky rules, the distributions from that account are tax free. I love that. Meaning after you put the money into your Roth, that tax-free growth, you never have to worry about taxes again. So the younger you are and the lower your tax bracket is, the more important it is to do Roth. Now, with traditional, the contributions go in before you pay federal or state income taxes. So traditional makes more sense when you get into a higher tax bracket or when you're closer to retirement and you have less money for that, less time for that money to grow. So another reason you might want to do traditional is, let's say you live in a high income tax state like California, Illinois, or New York, but you plan to retire in a state like Tennessee, where I am, or Texas or Florida, where they have no state income tax. Sometimes it's really important to get that additional state income tax deduction and then take the money out when you're in a lower federal tax bracket and you don't have state income taxes. Sorry. I was talking about income taxes when I wasn't on the slide. So it's really important to think about some of these income taxes when we're there. So when we talk about income taxes, this is really, really confusing for a lot of people. Income taxes are considered progressive. So what that means is that as you get more income each year, you pay more tax rates. As you get into those higher tax brackets, only that extra dollar of additional income get taxed at that rate. So if you're on the edge of tax brackets, like you're going from the 22% tax bracket to the 24 tax bracket, it doesn't mean that every single dollar eventually gets taxed at 24%. It's only those next couple of dollars getting into that 24% tax bracket that gets taxed there. So that's why it's called your marginal tax bracket, just meaning that marginal or incremental dollar gets taxed a little bit higher. There's also this thing called your effective tax rate, because your effective tax rate, even if you get into the 24% marginal bracket, may only be 15%. That's because guess what? You get a standard deduction where some of your income gets taxed at 0%, then a little bit gets taxed at 10%, then a little bit gets taxed at 12%, a little bit gets taxed at 22%, and then some at 24%. So when you blend all those together, your effective tax rate is usually a lot lower than your marginal tax rate. And when we're going back to your pay stub, when you see that tax withholding, that's just an estimate of what you're going to owe at the end of the year. If you don't withhold enough, you might still owe more money when you file your taxes at the end of the year. If you withhold too much, don't worry. When you file your tax return, you're going to get those extra tax payments back via refund. Ideally, you would end the year not owing anything and not getting any refund. If you get a refund, that's not this great thing. It just means you paid too much into the year and you gave the government an interest-free loan with your money. I'd much rather you earn that interest in that high yield savings account. But again, if you don't end up withholding enough and you end up owing, don't worry. Unless you have an underpayment penalty, the underpayment penalty just means you didn't pay in enough for the year as far as the government's concerned. So you can't just intentionally withhold way too much out of your paycheck. But I get that this sounds confusing, but when you get your W-4, when you're starting your job, just fill out your tax withholding information to the best of your ability. Especially your first year, there's going to be some figuring out of that. Just do your best. You can always change that around a little bit. So hopefully that was helpful. I know I covered a lot in a very short period of time, but it's really important. These are some foundational things. So if you found this helpful, make sure to, follow along on our LinkedIn pages. That's Shadle Financial Group or me, David Shadle. We're always here to help. We've also got a YouTube channel. So be on the lookout for that replay to be distributed out to you. And if there's anything that we can do to help, let us know. Thanks for joining.